Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Best Practices for Hosting a Cultivating Success webinar. We're glad that you joined us today. I'm Colette DePhelps and I'll be giving today's presentation. I'm with Cultivating Success. I'm on the Bi-State Leadership Team and the Idaho Cultivating Success Team. I'm also an area educator in community food systems and I serve the 10 northern counties of Idaho. Today with me, I have Mackenzie Lawrence. Mackenzie is a program assistant in community food systems and small farms with U of I Extension, and she will be moderating today's webinar. A couple of tips as we get started. For best practice, if you can close all the other programs running on your computer, that will probably be able to allow you to have a much smoother webinar experience today. If you do find that you're having difficulties with your sound, with speed or clarity, you can switch to the phone. A call-in number was provided in your welcome email. And at any time, if you're having challenges with the webinar or you have questions for myself, you can type them into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Mackenzie is monitoring that box, so if you're having technical difficulties, just let her know. So for today's webinar, we're going to cover a few topics about best practices, and we're going to start with why even present a Cultivating Success webinar. Then we'll talk about how growers will access webinars. And then I'll move into best practices for planning and designing your webinar, how to schedule a Cultivating Success webinar as a presenter, and we'll talk a little bit about equipment and logistics. Cultivating Success started offering webinars in Idaho in 2018, and we continued to offer them in 2019. We saw that the webinars were a great complement to our workshops and courses, and that we could provide information on new topics or provide more in-depth information on topics that we introduced in our workshops and courses, but didn't have time to go into deeply. At the bi-state team level for Cultivating Success, we decided to expand our webinars to cover Washington and Idaho and to offer educators from Washington the opportunity to be a presenter in a Cultivating Success webinar. We really saw that this was going to broaden the amount of expertise available to our small acreage producers and that we would be able to address more topics and issues of interest to our course participants. What you see on the screen right now is the Cultivating Success website where you can identify what has been given in a webinar, so you can peruse those topics. You can watch some webinars that have been offered in the past and think about what you might want to offer to students in this coming year. So a few things about webinars that are great for growers and other viewers. One is that they're easy to access. Using the Zoom platform and actually other webinar platforms like GoToWebinar, most of the time there's not an issue accessing a live webinar or a recording from a smartphone, tablet, or computer. They also lend themselves to group viewings on large screens. So in the event that there's a webinar that's of interest to a number of people in a specific location, they can get together and watch that together and have a group discussion after that. Also for educators who are located in counties where the internet service may not be strong enough for individuals to watch webinars at their homes, they can come into the extension office or another central location to view the webinar as a group. Also, there's an opportunity just to reach more people across geographic regions. Oftentimes, our growers are isolated geographically and they have minimal access to educational programming that is specific to their geography, whether that be Idaho or Washington. We also have the opportunity to offer these webinars across multiple time zones. In the 2019-2020 year, we are going to be offering those webinars at 11 o'clock a.m. for Pacific time zone and 12 o'clock p.m. for Mountain time zone allowing people to watch the webinars over their lunch hour. And we also have the opportunity to reach a wide range of demographics. So if you have an audience that is a Spanish-speaking audience, we are happy to host webinars for that audience in particular. So for Cultivating Success students, there's going to be two ways that they can access webinars. They can go to either the Idaho Cultivating Success main webpage, which you see on the left, or the Washington Cultivating Success main webpage. We will have buttons on both of these pages that link to signing up for our current webinar series. Right now you can see that we have the recorded webinar button on the Idaho Cultivating Success webpage. So once they have gone in and clicked on a link to register for a webinar, they'll go into the Zoom system. They'll get to register for the webinar, and you can see what the webinar registration looks like, and then they'll get continual reminders about the upcoming webinar. After the webinar is recorded, they'll be able to come back to our main websites, and as you can see with the Cultivating Success site, there will be a link to recorded webinars. They'll be able to go in and look at the different topics that we have, click on the link, watch the webinar, and then they'll be sent to a Google form where they'll be asked to put in their email address, name, city, and state. And this really allows us to keep track of who is accessing our webinars so that we can do follow-up evaluation with them. After they submit their webinar, their Google form to watch the webinar, they'll get a link to a page that is specific to that webinar. Here you see the webinar page for Access to Capital. There will be a button where they can watch the recorded webinar, which has been posted on YouTube, and they can download the presentation slides, which is really helpful, especially if you have a lot of resources that you've listed in those slides. A few things about webinars for instructors. It's great because they're affordable for us to offer. We can eliminate a lot of time and cost of travel by using online platforms. We have platforms that are available to us for free through our institutions. Both WSU and University of Idaho have Zoom available at no cost. We can create our content using common programs such as PowerPoint or Prezi. And it's very convenient because our audience can watch the webinars live, or they can view the recording through the web-based links that we're providing. So we're able to offer live programming, offer recordings for folks that miss that live programming, and then be able to present the webinars as a body of knowledge continually available when it fits into the schedule of our target audience. So factors to consider when you're planning a webinar. One is your topic and your audience. So will the content that you want to portray to your audience be something that can be conveyed in a 1-hour presentation? Or is it something that you may want to schedule multiple webinars so you have an introduction and then you're able to go in depth on specific topics? That would be an option for us with land access, as we could have an introductory overall land access webinar, and then perhaps we would follow that up with a more specific webinar on what makes a good lease agreement, or another webinar on succession planning. So you can see, you can think about a multiple stage approach to your webinar education. You'll want to consider the Zoom platform capabilities, and there are some limitations to Zoom. It is largely a one-way dialogue with some breaks for question and answers, but again, it's a great way to do an introduction or reach audiences that we have a difficult time reaching because of geography or their ability to attend an in-person program. So the content and design, I'll be showing you some very specific examples of what might work or might be challenging within a webinar. But if you have a lot of small detailed information, that could be something that would be hard to convey through a webinar presentation. It doesn't mean that you can't think creatively about how to address that. You might decide that you're going to send out to the registrants some things that they can print in advance that they would be able to have in front of them that you would refer to during the webinar, especially if you're looking at spreadsheets or something that is more complex in that way. But you'll want to think that through before you decide if you're going to offer the webinar, and then if you decide to offer it, to let us know as coordinators supporting you what documents you would like your participants to receive beforehand. Your equipment, we'll go over some of the equipment needs, but it is important that you have a good sound system and that you have a very reliable computer and internet for offering the webinar. And then your skills. You know, some of us are able to stare at a screen and create an engaging presentation. Others, it's just not our medium, and we really know that our presentation skill set is oriented to in-person education, and that's great. That's something that maybe you won't know until you give it a try, but we are definitely excited for you to consider the option of doing a Cultivating Success webinar. So thinking a little bit more about content and design. Is the webinar a good fit for your content? With webinars, we try to have minimal text, visually engaging photos, graphics, um, and we also can link over to some short video segments, which is a great way to engage your audience. At the beginning of each webinar, it's really important to introduce yourself. I did that through a slide with my photo and Mackenzie's photo. Another way that we've done that on our webinars, especially when we have multiple presenters, is we've used a small picture up in the corner of the slide as we had a new presenter talk about a new topic. So in this farmland access webinar, when it was the beginning of my presentation, I had my photo up in the corner. And then when it switched over to my co-presenter, we put her picture up in the corner so that people could know who was talking. We've also had presenters who have used a live webcam and have done an actual demonstration of using fiber with that webcam. And so that was a really interesting thing to do as well. If you are going to use your live webcam, my recommendation would be that you plan to have the webcam on the entire time, because with the Zoom technology, if you do turn your webcam off after the webinar is started, then you're going to have the black box with your name or your static photo during the rest of the webinar. So you want to think about the amount of content per slide. In general, you do not want to go over 20 to 40 seconds per slide. You can think about using animations if you want to put more text on one slide. I did use animations in a couple places in this presentation, so you can kind of get a feel for what it's like to scroll through the animations as a viewer, but also I've used some slides where you just get the text as a whole. You can decide what you like best. You're definitely going to want to do some limits on your text. And this is something that we have to play with, because oftentimes we do want to give enough information so that people have a takeaway. We know that they're going to get the slide handout. But if there's some real in-depth information you want to convey, it may be good to develop a secondary handout that we make available on the website. Think about including pictures or illustrations, because that definitely makes each slide more interesting. And take the time to pose some questions to your audience. So for instance, in this webinar, we had a question: what are some questions you think you might ask? And that's a good prompt where you can stop the webinar and see if there's any questions that somebody might put into the question box to make it a little bit more interactive. So graphs and charts, it's important that they're clear and that they convey what you want conveyed. In this particular chart, while all those numbers are really difficult to understand, the main point of this slide was looking at how full different water reservoirs were and the size of those reservoirs. So with that, you can really get a feel for that from this slide, and you can also see the geographic region that the reservoirs are located in. So in that way, this is an easy to explain graphic, even though it has more information than is being used specifically in the webinar. And the content can be grasped quickly. Here's another example of a graphic. And so this one was showing 3 different pieces of information. So survey responses, looking at what was considered counties with a visible local food scene in the study area, and then some demographics about the respondents. So again, there's a lot of information on this slide, but it is visually engaging and it doesn't take a lot of time to explain the content. Another example where a photo has been used to demonstrate a little bit more visual interest along with a graphic for the survey results. This is a great description of a process. So these are really great types of graphics that you can use that show cycles. You can do them so that you have animations, different pieces appear throughout your conversation, or you can use it as a static diagram, but definitely not too much information for a webinar platform. Now, this is another example of information that was in one of our webinars. And one of the reasons that this worked is because the point was not to unpack the information that was in the graphic, but rather to tell someone where they could find this information and explain what they would find in the graphic. This is something that I think it would be important to back up with links in your presentation or additional handouts that we make available to viewers on the website or the web page for the particular webinar that they're watching. Here's another pretty busy slide where we introduced a handout that we had made available to participants. So the purpose of this was to call their attention to a handout that they would want to look at after the webinar, not to unpack the content of this particular chart. Within the Cultivating Success platform, you can do live polls, and we've done those quite a lot. You can do polls like this to get a little bit of information about your audience and to help your audience understand who is on the webinar. And the one thing that we've learned with the Zoom technology is that when you do a poll, that is something that is very interactive for the people that are actually watching the live webinar. However, Zoom does not record everything that is seen during the poll when the questions are asked and the results are displayed. So that's a little bit of a weak link for this programming. And so that requires an extra step of editing out that portion of the recorded webinar to make it a seamless viewing. So we are investigating some editing software to be able to do that. So we will support polls. We just want you to know that there is a little bit of extra work on the backside of that for the recording if you choose to do polls. So questions, it's important to assign time slots for Q&A. Generally speaking, our webinars are between 40 minutes and 1 hour. And so it's helpful to have 1 or 2 time slots for Q&A. So at this point in time, I'll go ahead and pause to see if there's any questions.
I don't have any questions that have been submitted at this time.
Okay, great. If anybody who's watching the webinar does have questions, you can go ahead and type those into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, and we're happy to answer those questions. So finally, you're going to want to include at the end of your webinar, what are some next steps for your webinar participants? So that could be a resource link or list, links, um, telling them about handouts and supplemental materials that are being made available with the webinar slides and recording through the Cultivating Success website. And then you have the option to do a Zoom integrated post-webinar survey for evaluation. Usually the webinar surveys that we do are about 7 questions long. It's nice because with Zoom, this is going to be something that will come up right after the end of the webinar with your viewers having the ability to link directly to a post-webinar survey that we host in SurveyMonkey. And then we can provide you with the results of that post-webinar survey. Some of the other webinar platforms like GoToWebinar do have an integrated webinar survey tool. Zoom did not have that last year. Maybe that is something that they will come out with in the future, and then we would be able to use that. But this works quite well. So with that, have you decided that webinars really are in your wheelhouse? That webinar is a good fit for your content? That you think you'll be comfortable talking on camera or to your computer screen? That you feel like you can engage with an unseen audience? And really important that you can stay cool when technology fails, because it's really rare that we get through a webinar without a few technical glitches, or myself personally getting through a webinar without stumbling over my words a little bit. But really, equipment and logistics makes a huge difference for how well the webinar flows on the side of the participant and on the side of the presenter. So I want to talk a little bit about the audio equipment that works best. So using a cabled headset, preferably a USB headset, is going to give you the best audio quality. And these headsets do wear out, so there might be a time that you have to replace it, but a really good USB headset can be purchased for less than $30. You want to make sure that your co-presenters and guests also have headsets, because that's going to make a lot of difference for them and for you as you transfer between presenters. If they don't have a headset, either yourself or your guests or co-presenters, I would suggest that they call in on a landline and use the telephone. So not a cell, because you can get a lot of feedback or interruption in service, but that they actually call in on a landline when they're doing their presentation, and that's going to have the best audio. And then it's also important to know how to mute yourself and your co-presenters, and if you choose to do some live Q&A, how you mute your audience. Moving on to computer equipment. You're definitely going to want to install on all your updates, especially if you have one of those Microsoft systems that will update for you and shut your computer down, because that would be a challenge. Turning off your screensaver, especially if it has uh, a short time frame before it clicks back on, and you know that you have some more lengthy explanations on individual slides. Only open necessary programs, especially if you're switching between PowerPoint and videos or showing some things that are on the internet. You don't want to have to fumble through your email and multiple different programs to find what you want to show to your audience. Make sure that you're plugged into power so that you're not running off your battery, and turning off your computer notifications, or making sure that the screen that you're showing is not the screen that has computer notifications if you have a multiple screen setup. And then thinking about your studio or your office. Make sure that you won't be disturbed. You might want to put a do not disturb sign on your door if you have a really busy office, or to look at a space that is separate from your coworkers. It is helpful to have a separate studio space for your co-presenters it will make the switch between your presentation and that of your co-presenter more smooth. You can do it if you have to be in the same place, but it will be more smooth if you can just hand off the mic and the PowerPoint presentation to your co-presenter. And you're going to want to practice handing that off because it may actually work better depending on the technical skills of your co-presenter or the bandwidth of their internet, that you would advance slides for them, or vice versa, they would advance slides for you versus handing off the mouse to a new presenter. And then you're going to want to practice. So if it's your first time doing a webinar or your co-presenter's first time, we should schedule a test webinar. It probably will not take an hour, but about 30 minutes to go through a segment of your webinar presentation to make sure your sound is good, you know how to turn your mic on and off, how Zoom works in general, how you're going to transition to each co-presenter. And then we can talk about anticipating and troubleshooting problems. One of the things that I've found is that when problems happen, I just talk people through them. I just say, I'm really sorry, we're losing some sound or we're having some challenges with speed or transitioning between programs, and then I just jump in as the moderator and have a bit of conversation during that transition. I find that people are really understanding and they're patient. You're going to want to also log in early. If the webinar starts at 11 a.m., you definitely want to log in at least 15 minutes early, make sure that everything's working, you have the right copy of your PowerPoint presentation loaded, and then we can take a break if we have time before the hard start at 11. So to sign up to offer a Cultivating Success webinar, we have created a Google form that has all the different dates that are available for webinars. You'll see that for the moderating, I've made notes when I am unavailable. That doesn't mean we can't do a webinar on that date. It just means that we want to make sure that we have another Cultivating Success team member who is available to be the moderator during that time period. What we're asking is that when you do register for offering a webinar, that you have the presenter name, the title of the presentation, and then a 1 to 2 sentence description. And these need to be complete because that's what we have to pull off of the Google form to put on the website and to put in Facebook promotions and our other marketing materials. So we'll consider something confirmed once all of those descriptions are filled out. We'll be sending you this link to the spreadsheet, and you can go ahead and look at the different opportunities to do the webinars between December and the end of April. A little bit about the support that we're able to provide to you as speakers. So we'll be providing a PowerPoint slide template with some base slides for consistency and presentation. You can see on the left is the PowerPoint template that we used last year. We're going to be developing a new one with our branding, and we'll make sure that you have access to the Cultivating Success logos and icons to use in your presentation. We will set up the Zoom and the links for registration and for you as presenters. We will promote the webinar through our websites and our Cultivating Success Facebook pages and our email lists. We'll provide a moderator to assist with the live webinar. If that is not me or Mackenzie, then we'll work to find another educator that has experience offering webinars that can support you. We'll help with the Zoom integrated post-webinar survey and get that loaded and available. And then once the webinar is complete, we will post a recording of the webinar and the handouts to YouTube and the webinar webpage. We can then also provide you with participant information about people that have viewed the webinar live, the results of the survey, and then we can provide you information about who has viewed the recording of the webinar in their contact information because they're registering through the Google form. We can also let you know if there has been some finds and viewings of the webinar through YouTube, because that number would be different than the number of people who access the webinar through the Google form. So with that, I'm going to stop. That's all the content I had for today's webinar, and I'd like to answer any questions that you might have. Are there any questions that came in, Mackenzie?
No questions in the chat or in the Q&A box.
Okay, great. So if you don't have any questions, I'm going to conclude today's webinar. You see my phone number and email. I am happy to help you design your webinar. If there's some questions that come up later, to definitely answer those. And we'll get you the link to the sign-up form and to a recording of this webinar if you want to go back and view it again. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great afternoon.